Now that you have a basic understanding of Mendel and Mendel's principles, or at least the first two principles that Mendel developed, there's absolutely some vocabulary that is just a must for you to understand going forward. Of the 6 words that we have here, I want you to think of them in groups of 2. So gene and allele we're going to deal with together, genotype and phenotype together, and homozygous and heterozygous together. The distinction between gene and allele is a subtle one. A lot of times people use those words interchangeably, but there is actually a difference between them. Whenever you have a trait, you're going to inherit 2 genes for that trait. You're going to get 1 gene from your mom and 1 gene from your dad. Let's just deal with the pea plants for a second, since that was our example earlier. You were dealing with the height of a pea plant. So each pea plant is going to receive 2 genes for height. But what type of genes? What version of those genes? There was the version that led to being tall. There was the version that could lead to being short. Those different versions are referred to as alleles. So there are tall alleles and short alleles, or dominant alleles and recessive alleles, both for the same gene. When it comes to genotype and phenotype, as I just mentioned, you're going to inherit 2 genes for a trait, one from your mother, one from your father. Whatever your combination of those 2 genes happens to be, that's your genotype. Based on those genes, you're going to express a certain trait, as in you might have blue eyes, or you might have brown eyes, or you might have blonde hair, or you might be 6'2", or you might be 5'3". All of those outward expressions of those genes is your phenotype, what you look like, in other words. So you have certain genes, that's your genotype, and they lead to what you look like, that's your phenotype. Last combination here, homozygous and heterozygous. The prefixes there tell the story. Homo means the same and hetero means different. So again, going back to that idea that you inherit 2 genes for each trait, are those 2 genes the same as each other? Are they the same alleles? If they are, you would be described as homozygous for that particular trait. If they're different, then you're heterozygous. That should all make sense here in a minute. These 6 words, though, absolutely, I'm just going to have to use them in context going forward. And so if you don't know them, you're going to be a little bit lost about the concepts I'm talking about, because you're going to be mired in the vocabulary. So please, these 6 words, you've got to know this vocabulary. What we're going to deal with as we use that vocabulary is something called a Punnett square. Now, I'm assuming that you are already a bit familiar with Punnett squares from your time in middle school. The idea of any Punnett square is that of a prediction. You're going to predict, in essence, what an offspring could be given 2 parents, parent A, parent B. What could they have as offspring in terms of specific genetic traits? It's a prediction. And we are going to deal specifically with a monohybrid Punnett square to start. Mono, of course, just means 1. So we're going to deal with 1 trait at a time. And the type of trait we're going to start off with here in this example is one of complete dominance. In other words, it's Mendelian, as in it operates under those guidelines that we talked about. The principle of dominance, where there are 2 versions of any gene, and one of those versions, one of those alleles, completely dominates or masks or overpowers the other. To show you a basic monohybrid Punnett square involving complete dominance, we're going to look at just a made-up example here. I chose the trait of fur color, so I imagine we're talking about some type of animal. And if you look at the alleles, as in the 2 versions of genes for this particular trait, I have a capital B representing brown fur. The reason it's a capital is because that represents the dominant allele. And then I have a lowercase b representing black fur, and it's a lowercase b because it's the recessive allele. So brown fur being a phenotype, it is the outward expression. Black fur also a phenotype, it's the outward expression. Then below, you can see there are genotypes. Remember, and I said it multiple times already, every individual inherits 2 genes for any given trait, one from your mother, one from your father. So what combinations are there? Well, you can see the big B, and we're going to use terminology to describe that as homozygous dominant. Remember, homozygous means 2 that are the same, and then we tack the word dominant on so that you know, okay, there's 2 that are the same and they are both dominant. If you flip to the very bottom here, we have 2 little b's, and I'm going to use the phrase homozygous recessive to describe that genotype. Homozygous, 2 that are the same, and they are both recessive. The only other possible combination is one big B, one small b, and we're going to use the term heterozygous to describe that because heterozygous means 2 different. We have 2 different alleles for that particular trait. So that all sets up the idea of the Punnett square. Now let's actually look at how to do one. Here's our square, here's our example. And what we've done here is to take one parent, and I've chosen a parent that is heterozygous, and I'm going to put that parent along the top of the square. And you can see I have the big B over one portion and the little b over the different portion. And we're going to take the other parent and we're going to put them along the side. So 2 parents, one along the top, one along the side. And again, for parent number 2, I chose them to be heterozygous. Big B along one portion here, little b along the other portion. Now, before we go any further, let's imagine what's really happening here is that we've got 2 parents and they're going to have children, or at least a child. The idea here is that of a prediction. Why do we have the parents lined up on the outside of this box the way that we do? Well, let's take this line here and let's just, in our imagination, extend it so that we seem to be separating this big B from the small. What you're really doing there is the principle of segregation, which you'll remember goes back to the idea of meiosis. So that in meiosis, this big B ends up in one sex cell, and this little b ends up in a different sex cell. In other words, they can't be passed on together. Only one at a time can be passed on. And we can apply that same idea over here. So they are being separated. Let's say this is the father up here. Here's one sperm, here's another. This would be the mother on this side. If we separate these, here's one of her eggs, here is the other. And so, of course, to get offspring, sperm and egg have to come together, and that's what these boxes in the middle are going to represent. What are the possibilities? If you bring down this sperm and combine with this egg, you get the possibility of a child being homozygous dominant. If you bring down this sperm and combine it with this egg, you end up with the possibility of a child that is heterozygous. Down, across, another possibility of heterozygous. Down, across, and you have the possibility of homozygous recessive. Now, this does not mean that these 2 parents are going to have 4 children just because there happens to be 4 blocks here. It just means that each time these 2 parents have a child, these are the possibilities of what that child could be. 25% homozygous dominant, 50% likelihood of being heterozygous, 25% likelihood of being homozygous recessive. As a matter of fact, what I just gave you there is what's known as the genotypic ratio. 1 genotype, homozygous dominant, 2 that are hetero, and 1 that's homozygous recessive, a 1 to 2 to 1 genotypic ratio. Or you could talk about something that's referred to as a phenotypic ratio. Remember what the phenotype is, what something looks like. In this case, either brown or black. This one's going to look brown. Even though this one has a different genotype, it's also going to look brown. So is this one. But the fourth one here is going to look black. So we have a 3 to 1 phenotypic ratio. Now it's probably time for some practice.